All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into the wild world of landlord-tenant law.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about those little things called notices to quit.
Oh,
Those official documents that can really stir things up.
definitely can be a bit of a Pandora's box. Lots legal twists and turns in there.
You got that right. And, whether you're the one cashing those rent checks or writing them, you've got to know how this whole notice to quit thing works. I mean, nobody wants to end up in a legal tug of war, right?
Absolutely not. Not
Yeah.
fun for anyone involved. And it's important to remember, these notices to quit, they're not just casual reminders. They carry some serious legal weight. Often the first step, that whole eviction process.
Yeah.
And believe me, that can get pretty stressful.
Okay, so let's paint a picture here for our listeners. Imagine you're a landlord, right? And you find out your tenants turned your peaceful suburban rental into a full-blown dog grooming salon. Puppies everywhere.
Oh, wow.
Definitely not in the lease agreement.
Yeah, that's a classic example of a lease violation that could land you a notice to quit.
Yeah.
It's not always about missed rent, right? It covers all sorts of situations where a tenant might not be holding up their end of the bargain.
It's like a big legal flag waving. It's like, hey, something's not right here. Time to fix it.
Exactly. It kicks off a formal process, gives the tenant a clear time frame to either sort things out or move on.
I was actually really surprised to find out there isn't like a one-size-fits-all notice to quit. They change all over the place.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Depends on where you live. It's like a legal puzzle, with each state having its own little quirks.
Oh, absolutely. You remember that case in California a while back? The tenant actually won their eviction fight because of a tiny little detail in the notice to quit. It was crazy. Just goes to show how crucial it is to know the exact laws in your state.
That's wild. So it sounds like both landlords and tenants have got to be extra careful, make sure every box is checked, every I dotted.
You got it. For example, some states, a 30-day notice might be enough for a month-to-month lease. Others, they demand a full 60 days. And for those serious breaches, like our dog grooming extravaganza, some states let landlords give super short notices, like as little as 3 days.
Wait a minute, 3 days? Really? That seems kind of harsh, doesn't it? How's a tenant supposed to find a new place and pack up their whole life in 3 days?
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about fairness and the impact on tenants. It really highlights how much these laws can vary. What's okay in one state might be totally out of bounds in another.
Okay, so let's say a landlord needs to write up one of these notices to quit. What are the absolute must-haves to make sure it's all legal and legit?
Think of it like your legal checklist, okay? You absolutely need the date it's sent out, the tenant's full name and address, a crystal clear reason why you're sending the notice, a firm deadline for them to be out, your contact information as a landlord, and, really important, a clear statement about what legal action might happen if they ignore the notice.
So we're not talking about a sticky note on the fridge here.
Nope, not at all. And beyond just what's in it, there's this whole thing about proper service. Landlords can't just, slip it under the door and hope for the best. They need proof the tenant actually got it. Otherwise, that whole "I never saw it" excuse might actually work in court.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what's the best way to make sure that notice gets delivered?
Certified mail, that's a popular one. You get a record that it was delivered, or in-person delivery, but with a witness there. That basically removes any doubt,
So it's like sending a super important letter, the kind where you got to sign for it. It got where it needed to go.
Exactly. And we've been talking a lot about what landlords have to do, but let's not forget the tenant side of this. Getting one of these notices to quit, that can be a real punch in the gut, especially if you weren't expecting it.
Yeah, I bet it feels like the ground's been pulled out from under you, especially if you think everything's fine.
It really can. So it's super important for tenants to really read that notice carefully. Make sure it follows the state laws and their lease agreement. If anything seems wrong or unfair, getting a lawyer involved is a good idea.
Yeah, like having a legal translator, right? Someone to decode all the jargon and make sure you're protected. But we were talking earlier about those common mistakes landlords make.
Right. Those traps they can fall into.
Tell me more about that.
Well, one of the biggest ones is just not knowing the specific eviction laws in their state. Remember that legal puzzle we mentioned? Using the wrong words, the wrong format, even messing up the dates on the notice, that can make the whole thing invalid.
Wow, so even a small mistake can have huge consequences.
Oh, yeah. It could mean the difference between a successful eviction and the case getting thrown out of court. Landlords really need to be on top of their game, understand all the legal nuances.
You mentioned documentation earlier. It seems like keeping good records is crucial for landlords, especially if things get really messy.
You got it. Documentation is key. It's not enough to just, think you sent a letter or made a phone call. You need actual proof that you followed all the right steps. Imagine you're in court, right? You got to show the judge you did everything by the book. Good records, that's your best friend in that situation.
So we're talking detailed notes, copies of all the notices, those certified mail receipts, all part of the landlord's toolkit.
You got it. And here's a big one. One of the worst mistakes a landlord can make: trying to handle things themselves, like changing the locks, shutting off utilities, or even trying to force a tenant out by moving their stuff.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds totally illegal.
It is. And it could lead to lawsuits, big legal trouble for the landlord. It's a reminder that even if a tenant's not playing by the rules, a landlord can't just take the law into their own hands.
Like playing judge, jury, and executioner all at once, not a good look.
Exactly. There's a legal process for a reason. Skipping steps can have serious consequences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about the tenant. What if you're the one on the receiving end of this notice to quit? What's the first thing you should do?
First things first, don't freak out. Take a deep breath and really look at the notice itself. Does it match up with the laws in your state? Does it line up with your lease agreement? Are all the details correct? If anything seems fishy, or you think the notice is bogus, talk to a lawyer. ACP.
Yeah, it's like having a legal expert in your corner, guiding you through the whole thing.
Exactly. They'll help you understand your rights, make sure you're protected, could even stop things from getting worse.
That's good to know.
Now, going back to those landlord mistakes, I want to emphasize again how important it is for them to really know the eviction process in their state, inside and out.
Yeah, it seems like they could trip up at every corner if they're not careful. Can you give us an example?
Sure. In some states, a landlord can't just file for eviction the second tenant misses a rent payment. There are specific steps they got to take, timelines they got to follow, even if the tenant is clearly in the wrong. It's not as simple as you missed rent, get out.
So even if it's obvious the tenant broke the lease, the landlord still has to follow the proper legal steps.
Absolutely. And it usually starts with that formal notice to quit. And as we've said, that notice needs to be done right, delivered properly, all the details in order.
I'm guessing a missing date, the wrong address, even something small like that could mess up the whole eviction process.
Yep, that's right. Think of it like a game of legal chess. Every move matters. A tiny detail in the wording, how it was delivered, can make or break the case.
Wow, it's a tricky balance, isn't it? Asserting your rights as a landlord, but also making sure you're following the law to the letter.
Absolutely. And that's why having a lawyer on your side is so important for both landlords and tenants. It's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure everyone's rights are protected and the whole thing is fair.
Okay, so let's imagine a landlord did everything perfectly. Sent the notice, followed all the rules, but the tenant still refuses to leave. What happens then?
Well, that's when things can get even more complicated. Usually the landlord's next move would be to file an official eviction lawsuit with the court.
So now we're talking about a real court case.
You got it. And this is where all that careful documentation we were talking about really matters. The landlord has to build a strong case, prove they did everything right, that the tenant violated the lease or didn't pay rent, and that they gave proper notice to move out.
Sounds like a paperwork nightmare.
It can be. That's why a lot of landlords hire lawyers who specialize in this stuff. Landlord-tenant law. They can make sure all the T's are crossed and all that.
So just to be clear, even at this point, when the landlords filed a lawsuit, they still can't personally kick the tenant out, right?
Oh, no. The whole eviction has to go through the court system. If the judge sides with the landlord, they'll issue something called an order of eviction. But even then, it's usually law enforcement, like the sheriff's department, who actually remove the tenant.
So yeah, it's serious business from beginning to end. No wonder it can be so stressful.
You said it. The stakes are high for everyone involved.
Okay, let's do a quick recap for our listeners. A notice to quit, it's an official document that sets a specific legal process in motion. It's crucial to know the laws in your state, follow the procedures perfectly, keep good records of everything, and if you're ever unsure, talk to a lawyer.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
But here's a thought. What if a tenant feels they were kicked out unfairly? Do they have any options?
That's a great question. And it opens up a whole other can of worms.
It really does sound like there's a whole other side to this whole notice to quit thing. What happens if a tenant feels like they got the boot unfairly? Like, do they have any options?
Yeah, it definitely gets even more complicated. It's like, it really depends,
Depends on what?
Well, All the specific details of the eviction, the laws in that particular place, and what kind of evidence there is. There's no easy answer, unfortunately.
Okay, let's say a tenant thinks they were evicted because of something completely made up. Like the landlord just invented a lease violation or said they didn't pay rent when they totally did. What can they do?
In that kind of situation, they might actually be able to fight the eviction in court. They would need to gather evidence, though, to prove the landlord's lying and show that the eviction wasn't legal.
So it's basically a legal battle, like he said, she said.
Pretty much, yeah. It comes down to having a strong case with good documentation and maybe even people who can testify to back up their claims.
And what could happen in that situation? Could they actually get the eviction reversed?
It's possible. If they can convince the court that the eviction was wrong, the judge might order the landlord to let them back in. And on top of that, they could even get money for the damages they suffered because of the eviction, like moving expenses, temporary housing, that kind of thing.
Wow, so there's a lot at stake for both sides. It really shows how important it is to be clear, keep good records, and know your rights, whether you're the landlord or the tenant.
You got it. And a good lease agreement, one that's clear from the beginning, can prevent a lot of these headaches and disagreements down the line.
Speaking of leases, are there any parts of a lease that tenants should really pay close attention to? You know, little things that could make a big difference if there's a fight.
Oh, for sure. One that trips people up all the time is the quiet enjoyment clause. It basically says the tenant has the right to use the property peacefully without being disturbed. Now, that doesn't mean they can party all night, but it does protect them from excessive noise from, like, the landlord or other tenants.
Ah, so that's where those noise complaints come in.
Exactly. And another big one is the part about the landlord's right to access the property. They can't just come in whenever they want. They usually have to give reasonable notice before entering, unless it's an emergency.
Yeah, I wouldn't want my landlord showing up unannounced all the time. That would be weird.
It's all about finding a balance, respecting the tenant's privacy, but also letting the landlord take care of things, like making repairs.
You know, it's amazing how complicated this whole landlord-tenant thing is. It's like peeling an onion. There's always another layer.
It really is. And that's why it's so important for landlords and tenants to have a decent relationship. Good communication, clear expectations, and just basic respect can go a long way to prevent problems.
All right, listeners, we've thrown a lot at you today, but let's do a quick recap. A notice to quit. It's a formal document that starts a specific legal process. You got to know the laws in your state, follow the right steps, document everything carefully, and if you're ever unsure, talk to a lawyer.
Well said.
And before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've been talking about the legal side of notices to quit, but let's not forget about the human side of things.
That's important.
Behind every legal case, there are real people going through real stuff. It could be a landlord trying to keep their business going, or a tenant worried about losing their home. Let's all try to be understanding and compassionate even when things get tough.
I like that.
And with that, we'll bring our deep dive into the world of notices quit to a close. Thanks for listening, and remember, knowledge is power. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay awesome.
Yeah, it can get pretty tricky. It really, like a lot of legal stuff, it depends.
Depends on what? I'm curious.
Well, on the specifics of the eviction,
Yeah.
and the laws of that specific place, and the evidence, of course. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, a tenant thinks they were evicted based on something totally made up, like the landlord just pulled a lease violation out of thin air or claimed they didn't pay rent when they actually did. What could a tenant do in that situation?
Well, in those cases, yeah, they might actually have a reason to challenge the eviction in court. But they would need proof, evidence to show the landlord's making stuff up and that the eviction wasn't legal. They got to build a case.
So it's like a legal battle then. A he said, she said with evidence.
You got it. That's a good way to put it. It comes down to presenting a strong case with documents and maybe even witnesses to back up their claims. Evidence is key to convince the court.
And what could happen then? Could the tenant actually get the eviction reversed?
It's possible, yeah. If they can prove the eviction was wrong, the court might order the landlord to let them move back in. And on top of that, they could potentially get money for what they lost because of the eviction, like moving costs, temporary housing, that kind of stuff. It's about making things right.
So there are ways for tenants to fight back if they think they've been treated unfairly. That's good to know.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for both sides, landlords and tenants, to understand their rights and what they're supposed to do. It's about making sure everyone's on a level playing field.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. We've learned a ton about notices to quit, the eviction process, even wrongful evictions. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's a whole world, isn't it? The ins and outs of landlord-tenant law. It can be fascinating.
It really is. So for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, what's the most important thing you'd want them to remember?
I'd say knowledge is power, whether you're a landlord or a tenant. Know your rights, understand the laws in your state, document everything carefully, communicate clearly, and if in doubt, get a lawyer. Those are the keys to navigating this whole landlord-tenant world successfully.
Well said. Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of notices to quit. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little entertaining. Thanks for joining us today. And remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay informed, and as always, stay awesome.
If this podcast helped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep making these videos. Thanks for watching.